Edric Galt found her just before dawn. He had been up since the second bell, same as always, pulling on his coat in the dark and crossing the frozen yard to check the water barrel before the cold sealed it over. The lantern in his left hand threw a small orange circle across the snow, and he almost stepped over her before the light caught the gray of her braids against the white ground. She was curled at the base of his fence post, knees drawn to her chest, one hand pressed flat against the earth as though she had been trying to push herself upright and simply run out of strength. She was enormous, taller than any man Edric had ever known, and broad in the shoulder, even half collapsed, and green, the deep earthen green of summer oak before the leaves turn. Tusks, small and pale, curved up from the corners of her mouth. Braids, gray going to silver, wound with strips of dark leather, had fallen loose across her cheek. He stood there with his lantern for 3 full seconds. He was not a fast man by habit, and he believed in thinking before moving. What he thought in those 3 seconds was this: she was breathing. Whatever else she was still breathing. He set the lantern in the snow and crouched down beside her. Her coat was soaked through, wool and oilskin, good quality once, now shredded at one shoulder where something had torn it. Under the shredded part, the cloth was dark with dried blood. When he pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck, her skin was hot enough that he pulled his hand back, startled. Fever. A bad one. How long she had been lying in the snow he could not say, but the cold had gotten into her, and the fever had gotten in too, and between the two of them they had brought her down. Edric straightened up and looked back at his house. He looked at the road that ran past his fence line, the road that led into Aldenvale proper, 3 miles east, where the inn was, where the physician was, where other people were. Then he looked back at her. She had an herb bag at her hip, a wide, flat bag of cured leather, packed so full the seams strained, hung from a belt that also held a short knife in a plain wooden scabbard. The knife was the kind a working person carries, not the kind a fighter reaches for. The bag smelled of things he couldn't name: dried root, something resinous, something faintly sweet. He didn't know much about healer's kits, but he knew what one looked like, and what he was looking at looked like one. He took a breath of cold air. He was 52 years old and a widower of 6 years, and not a young man strong. But he had lifted sacks of seed corn heavier than cents, and he had carried Myra through 3 winters of sickness before the 4th one took her, and he was not the kind of man who left a breathing creature in the snow to die of fever. He got his arms under her and lifted. She was impossibly heavy, but he had good boots and the determination of a man who had already decided, and he made it across the yard 1 slow step at a time, pushed through his own door with his shoulder, and got her to the long settle beside the hearth. He put wood on the coals and blew them up to proper fire. He got her wet coat off. The good shoulder came easy. The torn shoulder he worked around with care. The wound underneath had been dressed once awkwardly with a strip of her own undershirt. He left that for now. He filled his biggest pot with water and hung it over the fire. He found his wife's old medicine basket in the cupboard, the one he had never had the heart to move, and set it on the floor beside her. Then he sat down in his chair and watched the fire and waited for the water to heat. She woke 3 times in the night. The first time she tried to get up and he put a hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "You're safe. Lie still." She looked at him with eyes the amber color of old honey and said something in a language he didn't know and then went back under. The second time she was shivering so hard the settle shook, and he put every blanket in the house over her and sat on the edge of it and held her hand until the shivering slowed. Her hand was huge in his, her fingers half again as long as his, thick-knuckled, and along the inside of each palm there were calluses in the specific pattern that came from a lifetime of mortar and pestle work. He had seen the same pattern on the apothecary in Aldenvale, on the healer woman who had lived 3 valleys over before she passed. These were working hands. The third time she woke, she said, in careful and accented but unmistakably clear common speech, "The bag." He had it hanging on the chair back beside her. He put it in her hands. She opened it with the methodical patience of someone who had done the same thing in the dark, sick, with shaking hands, enough times to have learned how. She drew out a packet of dried leaves sewn into cheesecloth, a small clay pot sealed with wax, and a twist of something that looked like shaved bark. She held them out to him. "Fever tea," she said. "The leaves and the bark 3 minutes in the hot water, the pot not yet. Later for the wound." He took them and went to the fire. He made the tea the way she described. She talked him through it in that slow, careful way of someone translating out of a language they think in into one they merely speak. And when it was done, he helped her drink it, one arm behind her shoulders, tipping the cup in small sips the way you did with someone too weak to hold their own head up steady. She drank it all. She lay back. "Thank you," she said to the ceiling. Then, "What is your name?" "Edric Galt," he said. "You're on my farm. I found you by the fence post." A pause. "I remember falling," she said. "I had a horse. 3 days ago, I think, he went lame. I had been walking since." "3 days," he said. "It is farther from the past than I was told," she said, and there was something in her voice that might have been the ghost of wry humor if she had had the strength for humor. "My name is Vareth. I am sorry to be in your house." "Don't be sorry," he said. "Sleep." She slept. Edric did not. He sat in his chair by the fire and watched her breathe, and when the sky outside the window went from black to the deep blue of early morning, he banked the fire and went out to do his chores, leaving the door on the latch in case she called. He was back inside in 40 minutes. She was still asleep. He made porridge, ate standing at the stove, and went out again to mend the section of fence that had been troubling him for a week. When he came back at mid-morning, she was sitting up, the blankets around her shoulders, looking at his hearth with the expression of someone taking quiet inventory of an unfamiliar room. She was, in daylight, even larger than he had understood in the dark. Her head, when she sat straight, was nearly level with his standing. Her braids had been partially rebound, the ones she could reach anyway. The ones at the back of her head were still loose. Her wound, he noticed, had been redressed. She had the clay pot open in her lap, and the smell that came from it was sharp and green and medicinal. "You have good hands," she said when she heard him come in. "The fever dressing, even pressure." "My wife was sick a long while," he said. "You learn." She looked at him then, fully, the amber eyes taking him in, and she nodded once slowly, the way you nodded at something that made sense and that you respected. "I need to reach Aldenvale," she said. "I came down from the Greystone Pass seeking a plant that grows in the lowland meadows, alderroot. It does not grow above the snow line and I need it badly." She paused. "I will not trouble you further than today. If you have a horse you could spare." "You cannot ride for 3 days at least," he said. "Not with that shoulder." She started to argue. He could see it gathering in her face. "I'm not saying it to be difficult," he said. "I'm saying it because the fever is still in you. You were near dead in the snow last night, and one morning of sleep and some good tea hasn't undone that. You know this better than I do." She closed her mouth, looked at the fire. 3 days, she said, as though confirming it with herself rather than accepting it from him. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4, we'll see how the shoulder is. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You are not afraid of me." "Should I be?" She looked at him again carefully. "The last 3 villages I passed through," she said, "I was not permitted inside the walls. In the second one they threw stones." Edric absorbed this. "Well," he said, "I don't throw stones at sick women in the snow." Something passed through her face, not quite a smile, but the shape a smile makes when it is still deciding whether to arrive. She looked back at the fire. "Thank you, Edric Galt," she said. "I will try not to be too much trouble." She was, for the record, no trouble at all. She slept most of that first day. On the second day she was up before him, had found his water pail and the stove and made tea, not her own herb tea but regular breakfast tea from his canister, which she had apparently located by smell, and was sitting at his table when he came downstairs. The sight of her at his table hit him in a way he hadn't been prepared for. She was enormous in his kitchen. He had a low ceiling, and she sat with her back very straight, and her shoulders almost touching the shelf he'd hung at eye level, which was not eye level for her. But she sat with the ease of someone used to fitting themselves into spaces built for smaller people, and she had made enough tea for two, and she pushed his cup across the table to him when he sat down. On the third day he showed her the meadow behind the lower pasture where the alderroot grew. It was 2 miles south, but she walked it without complaint, moving through the snow with a rolling, economical stride, her herb bag over the good shoulder, a walking stick she had fashioned from one of his fence boards. She found the root in 20 minutes. She knew it by the way the snow sat above it, by something about the ground, and she gathered it with a care that reminded him of the way he had watched his mother garden, unhurried, deliberate, taking just what was needed and pressing the soil back after. She held a piece of the root up to the winter light and looked at it for a long moment. "Will it do?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She tucked it into the flat bag. "This will do." He didn't ask her what it was for. He thought it was her business. She told him anyway, on the walk back without preamble. "There is a sickness in the upland settlements," she said. "A lung fever. It takes the very young and the very old most quickly. Alderroot, steeped with blood moss and dried hawthorn, draws the fever from the chest. I have treated 12 cases in the last 3 months. If I can bring enough root back and teach 2 or 3 people the preparation, we will be able to handle what comes in the spring thaw." Edric walked beside her and thought about 12 cases of lung fever in a winter settlement, and the people who came in and out of the tents or the longhouses or whatever it was, and the ones who did not come out. "How far is the upland settlement?" he said. 4 days' ride, she said, 6 in the snow. "You walked 3 days to get here." "The pass was worse than I expected," she said again, with that same ghost of dry humor. "And I lost the horse." He looked at her, this enormous, silver-braided, quiet woman who had walked 3 days through a mountain pass in the middle of winter, alone, bleeding, to gather a root she needed, and had done it with the matter-of-fact determination of someone who had simply decided it was necessary and therefore it would be done. "I have a mare," he said. "She's sound and she knows mountain trails." Vareth looked at him. "I'm not giving her to you," he said. "I'm offering to lend her. You bring her back when you come back through." She was quiet for a moment. "I may not come back through," she said. "This route was opportunistic." "Then you send her back with whoever's heading south next," he said. "Or you leave her at the inn in Aldenvale with Bess Harrow, and Bess will get a message to me. She's reliable." Vareth was still looking at him with that long, careful look. "Why?" she said. He thought about it honestly, because she seemed like someone who deserved honesty rather than pleasantry. "Because you're going back to treat children with lung fever," he said, "and walking 4 more days in the snow isn't going to help them, and because you need to get there and I've got a sound horse." She turned her face forward, back to the track through the snow. He couldn't read Orc expressions with any certainty, but he thought the set of her jaw was something like moved. They walked the rest of the way back in a silence that felt companionable rather than empty. That night she ate supper at his table, salt pork and winter beans, which he made more of than usual without quite deciding to, and she told him, between careful bites, about alderroot, about the properties of blood moss and why it combined well with the root and the hawthorn, about the particular physics of lung fever, the way it pooled in the chest and what drew it out. She talked about it the way a craftsman talks about his craft, precisely, with the quiet pleasure of someone who knows their subject completely and rarely gets to explain it to someone willing to listen. He asked questions because he was genuinely curious, and because a man who had nursed a wife through 4 winters of illness found he had developed a more than passing interest in the mechanics of sickness and recovery. She answered each question with the same careful precision. She did not talk down to him. She treated his questions as reasonable and his understanding as adequate, which he found he appreciated. "You have been doing this a long time," he said. "Since I was 16, she said. "My grandmother was the clan's mending hand before me. I watched her for years before she let me touch anything." She considered. "I am 51 now, 35 years of this work." 35 years, he said. "More if you count the watching," she said, and that ghost of a smile arrived more fully this time briefly, before it stepped back out of sight. He did not ask her about the villages that had thrown stones. He thought she had probably answered enough hard questions for one evening. On the fourth morning, her fever was fully gone. She declared this with a matter-of-fact certainty. She had checked herself the way he imagined she checked her patients, methodically, without drama. And she was up and moving with a sureness that had not been there before. She helped him with the morning chores without asking, just picked up the yoke for the water pails with the ease of someone who had always known where the water pails were, and walked the job to completion. He watched from the barn door. She moved through his yard like the yard had always been hers, in that rolling, economical way. He saddled Bet, his mare, and showed her the mare's habits, the tendency to drift right on a switchback, the preference for being led across water rather than asked to go first, the small trick of breathing into her nostril to settle her. Vareth listened to all of it with full attention, the way she had listened to everything, and then she put her hand on the mare's neck and said something to the horse in the Orc tongue, very quietly, and the mare blew out a slow breath and dropped her head. "She'll do," Vareth said. He handed up the packed saddlebags. He had put in what food he could spare without embarrassing either of them about it, and the extra wool blanket, and a small glass jar of his wife's ginger salve for the shoulder, which was healing but not healed. She took the bags without comment, but she felt the weight of them and knew, he thought, what he had done. She mounted with the ease of long practice. The mare took her without fuss. She sat there a moment, looking down at him. 4 days, he said, maybe 3 on Bet. Maybe 3, she agreed. Then she said, "Edric Galt, I would like to tell you something." He waited. "My grandmother was the mending hand of the Greyvault clan," she said, "and her mother before her, and her mother before that. I am the 6th in the line. When a mending hand of the Greyvault travels, it is considered very poor fortune to let her die of cold in a stranger's field." She paused. "Which you prevented." "That was just the decent thing," he said. "Perhaps," she said, "but the decent thing is not always what is done." She gathered the reins. "You will have your mare back, and I will owe you a debt, Edric Galt, which I do not intend to forget." She turned the mare toward the north road. He watched her go, the great gray-braided figure on the small brown horse, which should have looked ridiculous and instead looked somehow exactly right, the way certain things click into the proportion they were always meant to have. He stood at his gate until she was out of sight. Then he went back inside and ate his breakfast alone in a house that felt, for the first time in a while, like it had recently held someone in it. He did not hear from her for 11 weeks. In those 11 weeks the winter deepened and then slowly began to ease. He mended his fences, turned his soil for the first planting, took his surplus grain into Aldenvale and traded it for what he needed. The town, as always, had things to say about various things, and Edric, as always, listened without much comment. He thought about her more than he expected to. Not in a sentimental way, he was not a sentimental man by nature, but in the way you think about a piece of work that impressed you, turning it over occasionally to look at it from different angles. The 35 years of practice. The walk through the mountain pass in winter, 3 days, alone, with a wound in her shoulder and a fever building, because 15 people in the uplands needed something and she was the one who knew where to get it. The way she had talked him through making her tea, patient and precise, when she barely had the strength to sit up. The calluses on her palms. He found the book she had given him more absorbing than he anticipated. He read it in the evenings, by the fire, with the same attention he had given years ago to a manual on crop rotation that had materially changed how he worked his back 40. The plant illustrations were extraordinary, each one detailed down to the finest root hair, each one labeled with its properties and the preparation methods in that clear, careful hand. He read the sections she had marked for him 3 times each, and then kept reading forward into sections she hadn't marked, and found they made sense, built on each other, the way a well-organized mind builds an argument. What the town had to say in the weeks following Vareth's passing through was mostly about the orc woman who had been seen on the North Road. Old Martin Gale claimed he'd spotted her from his upper pasture, which was probably true. Martin spotted everything from his upper pasture and considered it a point of personal pride. What followed from this spotting was the usual run of frontier wariness, speculation about whether she had come to scout, whether there would be more, whether the winter had driven them down from the uplands, and what that meant for the spring. Edric listened to all of this in the tavern one evening, drinking his one weekly cup of something hot, and found he had very little patience for it. He did not volunteer that he knew her. He was a man who believed that information shared in a tavern tended to become a different kind of information by morning, and he saw no need to speed that process along. He simply listened and drank his cup and went home. That said, there was something he thought about on the walk home in the cold, with the stars hard and clear above the valley road. He thought about what it cost a person to travel 3 days through a mountain winter, alone, when every door between the uplands and the lowlands was closed against her. Not the physical cost, that was clear enough, but the other kind. The cost of knowing the doors would be closed and going anyway because the work required it. He had known that kind of person once. He did not think it was common. In the 7th week, something happened. Joran Hale's daughter got sick. The Hales lived half a mile down the road, Edric's nearest neighbors, a big family, good people. The daughter was 9 years old and had always been robust, the kind of child who ran everywhere and climbed things, and when she went down with a chest cough in the 2nd week of early thaw, it seemed at first like the usual thing. By the 3rd week, it was not the usual thing. The cough had gone deep and settled, and her breathing had the bubbling quality that Edric recognized from Myra's 3rd winter, which had been a bad one. Aldenvale's physician had been out twice and shaken his head and prescribed rest and hot steam, and said they would know more in a week. Edric thought about Alderroot. He thought about it for most of one night, and in the morning he went to his medicine basket, the one he had kept after Myra, which he had added to slightly since Vareth's stay, noting down what she had told him about the various packets before she packed them back up. He had a small packet of dried alderroot that Vareth had sorted out from her own supply and left on his windowsill without comment. He had blood moss from the apothecary in Aldenvale. He had seen Myra's healer use it years ago and had always kept some on hand out of habit. He didn't have dried hawthorn, but he went to the edge of the south meadow where the hawthorn hedge grew and cut what he needed. He remembered her instructions precisely. He had a good memory, and she had been a precise teacher. He made the preparation carefully, the way she had described: steep the root and moss together first, low heat, patient, a full half-hour, add the hawthorn at the end for the last 10 minutes, strain through doubled cloth. It smelled like the meadow after rain, green and slightly resinous, and when he tasted a small amount it had a mild bitterness that spread warmly. He put it in a covered pot and carried it to the Hale farm. Joran Hale met him at the door. He was a man Edric had known for 20 years, steady and undemonstrative, and the look on his face was the look Edric remembered from his own mirror in the 3rd winter. That particular tight-eyed, set-jawed expression that comes from sitting with someone you love who is getting worse, not better, and not having anything useful to do with your hands. "I'm not the doctor," Edric said before Joran could speak, "but I've got something that was recommended to me by someone who knows what they're doing. I'm not promising anything, but it can't hurt and it might help." Joran let him in. He showed them how to administer it, small amounts, 3 times a day, warmed not boiled, with honey if the girl could take honey. He wrote down the steps as clearly as he could on the back of an old letter. He left the pot and the instructions and rode home. 3 days later Joran's wife came to his door to return the pot. She was not the type to make large gestures, but her eyes were bright and she held the pot with both hands and said, "Her breathing's clearer. She slept last night." Edric said he was glad. He gave her the written instructions for a second batch, in case she needed it, and told her where to gather the alder root when the ground softened enough. She thanked him twice and went home. He stood in his doorway after she left and looked out at the yard and felt something he did not try to name exactly. Satisfaction, perhaps, usefulness. The specific warmth of having done something that mattered, which he had not felt with that particular sharpness since the years he had spent at Myra's side. He told no one who had taught him. Word travels in a small valley, however, whether you help it along or not. By the 3rd week of thaw 2 other families had come to him, quietly, with children or elders who had the chest cough. He helped as well as he could, stretching his understanding, going back to his careful notes from the night he had watched her work. He felt acutely the limits of his knowledge. He was working from memory and explanation, not from 35 years of practice, and he said so plainly to everyone who came. He was not a healer. He was a farmer who had been taught something useful by someone who was. What he knew helped. Whether it would always help he couldn't say. On a clear morning in late thaw, 11 weeks after he had watched her ride north, he heard a horse in the lane. He was in the vegetable garden, turning soil, and he straightened up and shielded his eyes against the morning light. It was Bet. He recognized his mare by her gait and the white sock on her near foreleg, and then he recognized the rider, and then he noticed that Bet was not alone. There were 3 other horses on the road behind her, and their riders were not small. He set down his spade. Vareth rode into his yard the way she had ridden out of it, with that rolling ease, one hand light on the reins, except that now she sat straight and fully well, the silver braids rebound properly, the torn coat replaced by a long leather riding coat that looked oiled and warm. She pulled up at the gate and looked down at him with the amber eyes. "Your mare," she said, "is a very good horse." "She is," he said. "I'm glad she got you there and back." "And back," Vareth agreed. 3 days each way, as you predicted. She swung down with an ease that made the dismount look like stepping off a porch. She was holding a flat wrapped package under one arm. The 3 other riders had stopped at the gate. They did not come in, but they sat their horses with the upright patience of people content to wait as long as waiting was necessary. "The sickness in the upland settlements," Vareth said. 15 more cases identified since I returned, all treated. The youngest was 2 months old. She will be well." She said this quietly, with the directness of someone reporting facts, and he thought the quiet in it carried a weight of relief she was not going to put into larger words. "I'm glad," he said, "truly." She held out the flat package. "I owe you a debt. I said I did not intend to forget it." He took the package, surprised by its weight. Inside the wrapping, old cloth folded over several times with the efficiency of someone used to packing things for mountain travel, was a book. A proper one, thick, bound in good leather the color of pine resin, the pages dense with writing in a fine clear hand, and at intervals, careful ink illustrations of plants, roots, leaves, flowers, each labeled in 2 scripts, one he couldn't read and one that was the common alphabet. He turned the pages slowly. "It is a healer's manual," Vareth said, "the plant guide and the preparation notes. My grandmother wrote the first version. I have added to it over 30 years. This is a copy I made during the winter. I had a long convalescence and the copying kept me useful." A pause. "The copy is complete. The original remains with the clan." Edric looked up from the book. "Vareth," he said, "this is." You helped someone with the chest cough, she said. Joran Hale's daughter. He was quiet a moment. How did you know that? Because on my way through Aldenvale this morning I stopped for tea at the inn, she said, and a woman there told me, entirely unprompted, that Edric Galt down the South Road had saved the Hale girl's chest last month. She seemed to feel that you had been very quiet about it, which she found characteristic. There was a tone in her voice that was warmer than any he had heard from her yet, not quite teasing, but close. You remembered the preparation. I wrote it down, he said, the night you were here. You're a clear teacher. She looked at him for a moment. 2 of the 3 people behind me are healers in training, she said. The 3rd is my cousin who has a talent for coming along on journeys without being asked. She turned back to him. The Greyvault clan sends its respects, Edric Galt, and I wanted to tell you what you did in the uplands. 15 people treated, a child 2 months old. He held the book and thought about that. I only used what you left me, he said. You did the work. You remembered, she said. You applied it carefully. You went to the next door, that is not nothing. She looked past him at his house, the small, tidy farmhouse, the garden he'd been working, the fence line he'd mended over the winter. You live here alone. 6 years now, he said. She nodded. I travel the uplands in the spring and summer, she said. In the deep of winter I am usually at the clan settlement, 2 days north of the pass, but the pass crossing takes me through your valley. A pause, measured, as though she was choosing the next words with the same care she chose everything. I wondered if I might stop here when the road brings me. He felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't fully known was tight. You're welcome here, he said, any time the road brings you. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you. Come in, he said. I'll put the kettle on. You can introduce me to your cousin. Her cousin's name was Drath, and he was younger than Varath by what seemed like 15 years, with a cheerful, wide-open face, a scar through one eyebrow, and the specific energy of someone who was constitutionally incapable of sitting still. He found Edric's garden immediately interesting, and was out in it within 5 minutes of walking through the door, examining the turned soil and asking questions about what he was planting there. The 2 healers in training, a composed young woman named Sieve, and a tall young man so quiet he seemed to have decided silence was his contribution, sat at Edric's table and drank tea with the well-mannered patience of people who had been taught to be guests. Varath sat across from Edric at the table. She walked him through the book. Not all of it, they didn't have all day, but the section on chest fevers, which she had marked with a folded piece of cloth, and the section on wound poultices, which she had also marked. She was the same teacher she had been in the first days, precise and patient, treating his understanding as adequate, asking him questions to see what he had retained and filling in the gaps without comment. He found he had retained more than he expected. They were at the table for 2 hours. Drath came back in at some point and sat in the corner and sharpened his boot knife and interjected occasional questions that turned out, on reflection, to be sharper than they sounded. Sieve poured everyone a second cup of tea without being asked. The quiet young man, whose name turned out to be Orith, had looked at the shelf of Edric's house at some point and said, carefully, "You keep good herbs," and Edric had been warmer toward him from that moment. When they stood to go, Varath stood last, taking the time to pull on her riding coat with the methodical patience she brought to everything. "Spring," she said. "I will be through the valley again when the late meadow plants are ready to harvest, perhaps late in the 4th month." "Late in the 4th month," he said. She looked at him. "Edric Galt," she said, "when I was lying in the snow outside your fence post, the last coherent thought I had was that I had not gotten the alder root and I was going to fail 15 people who needed it." She said it plainly, without drama. "And then I woke up in your house with the fire going and the tea made." She paused. "What you did mattered, in ways you probably cannot fully count." He thought about the Hale girl sleeping through the night. He thought about the child 2 months old in the upland settlement who was going to be well. "You're the one who knew what to do," he said. "Yes," she said, "and you are the one who gave me the chance to do it." She tucked the riding coat's lapel flat with a precise motion. "Late in the 4th month, then." "I'll have the kettle ready," he said. She almost smiled. Properly this time, both sides, held for a full second, and then she went out into the spring sunshine and swung up onto her horse with that unhurried ease. And Drath followed, and Sieve, and Orith, and the 4 of them went up the road in a loose line, green-skinned and gray-braided and large enough to block the sun briefly as they passed his gate. He stood there until they rounded the bend and disappeared, and then he stood there a bit longer. He had the book in his hands. He had the memory of 2 hours at the table, precise and warm. He had the knowledge that somewhere 2 days north of the Greystone Pass, a child 2 months old was going to grow up and never know his name. He went back to his garden and picked up the spade. The soil came up black and rich in the late-thaw light, and the birds were loud in the hedges, and he turned the earth with the steady rhythm of a man who had decided that this particular morning was a good one. She came back in late in the 4th month, as she said she would. She came alone that time, just Vareth and a pack horse loaded with summer herbs from the upper meadows, heading to a trading post 2 valleys over, and she stayed 2 nights. She identified 6 plants in his hedgerows that he had always thought were weeds and told him what each one was for. He fed her both evenings and she corrected his porridge technique, gently but without apology, and the porridge was markedly better. They walked the south meadow in the evening of the 2nd day, and she showed him where the blood moss grew along the stream bank, how to identify it, how to take a cutting without damaging the root stock. She talked about her grandmother. Not a lot, a few sentences at a time here and there, the way a person mentions someone who is very present in their thinking, about how the old woman had worked, the standards she kept, the exacting patience that Vareth had initially resisted, and then, around the age of 30, had understood completely. He talked about Myra. Not a lot, a few sentences. The way she had faced the sick winters with humor which had surprised him, because he was not a naturally humorous man himself and had not expected humor to be what carried them through, but it was. Vareth listened to this with full attention. "She sounds like someone who understood what mattered," she said. "She did," he said. They stood by the stream in the evening light, the blood moss faintly luminous in the low sun, and the quiet between them was the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. She left the next morning with her pack horse and the herbs, and he watched her go again from the gate and went back to the garden. She came through again in midsummer, this time with Sieve, who was studying the lowland herbs, and they spent 3 days going through the book at his table. Sieve was doing the studying this time, and Vareth was teaching, and Edric found that watching her teach was like watching someone do something they had done for 35 years, which was to say it looked effortless and wasn't. She expected precision from Sieve in the same way she expected it from herself, without anger and without softening it, and Sieve met her expectations with the steady determination of someone who had decided to be equal to them. On the last evening, after Sieve had taken her notes and gone to sleep in the settle, Vareth sat across from Edric at the table and said, "She will be good. She already is in the ways that matter. The precision will come." "What are the ways that matter?" he said. "She is not afraid of hard cases," Vareth said, "and she does not give up when she does not know the answer. She finds the answer." A pause. "Those things cannot be taught, everything else can." He thought about that. "You have those things too," he said. "I had a very good teacher," she said. They sat in companionable quiet for a while, and outside the window the midsummer dark was warm and full of crickets, and the fire burned low. "Edric," she said after a time. "Yes." "I have been thinking," she said. She seemed to be choosing her words with even more care than usual, which was saying something. The pass crossing in the deep of winter is not always possible. There are years when the snow comes fast and the timing is wrong and the crossing is better attempted in spring. She paused. Your valley is south of the pass. It is a reasonable stopping point, and the south meadow has blood moss and alderroot and 3 other plants I have been cataloging. Another pause. I wondered if there might be a use to you for someone who could identify what grows on your land. He understood what she was saying and what she was not quite saying, and he thought about it honestly, in the way he thought about things steadily, without rushing. There's a good stone foundation in the south corner of the yard, he said, from a barn I pulled down 8 years ago. Good oak beams in the woodshed. I've thought about building something on that foundation more than once. She was very still across the table. A room, he said, or 2 rooms, whatever was needed. Whatever was needed, she repeated very quietly. You'd need space to work, he said. A prep table, shelving for the kit, good light, he considered, south-facing window. She looked at him for a long moment, the amber eyes steady, reading his face with the thoroughness she brought to everything. That is a generous offer, she said. It's a practical one, he said. You cross the pass twice a year. You need a stopping point south of it. I've got the foundation and the beams and a south corner with good light. And I find that I've gotten used to someone else being in the house. He said the last part plainly, because she deserved plainness. She looked at the table, then she looked back at him. I find I have as well, she said, gotten used to it. The fire had burned down to coals, and the crickets were loud in the summer dark, and the book lay between them on the table, his copy, her grandmother's work added to and completed over 35 years. And that was how it was settled, between 2 people of 51 and 52 who had each had their long years of solitude and were quietly, precisely done with them. They built the 2 rooms in early autumn, when the best weather for working in the south corner arrived. Drath came down for the frame raising. It turned out he was a better carpenter than he was almost anything else, which he admitted cheerfully and without embarrassment. And Orth came, and 2 Orc men from the upland settlement who moved timber with an ease that reduced what Edric had calculated as a 4-day job to a day and a half. The work was good. Edric was competent with timber himself, not brilliant, and working beside people who were better than him at the physical parts of the job. The heavy lifting, the precise notching of the corner joints left him free to be useful in the ways he was better suited. The levelness of the sills, the angle of the roof pitch to shed snow, the placement of the window relative to the afternoon sun. He had been on this land for 20 years, and he knew exactly how the light moved across that south corner in different seasons, and that knowledge turned out to matter. Joran Hale came over with his eldest boy to help with the window fitting and refused payment for it, and said only that he was glad of the chance to be useful. And his voice, when he said it, had that careful quality that Edric recognized as a man saying thank you in a way he didn't have the words for. The boy helped without being asked twice about anything, which Edric noted and approved of. By the time the first snow came, the south corner had 2 new rooms, warm and dry, with a prep table of good thick oak and shelving along the south wall, and a window that caught the afternoon light like the inside of a lantern. Varath moved her kit in with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. She arranged the shelves in an order that made sense to her, which she explained to him so that he would know it, and he listened and understood it, and found he was inclined to agree with the system. She hung her herb bags on the east wall where the air circulated. She put her grandmother's original healer's manual, the older one, the one she had copied from, on the shelf above the prep table, in the place of honor where it would be seen whenever she worked. She ran a hand along the shelf edge and nodded once to herself. The first patient came in December, a child from the Hale farm, the eldest boy who had helped with the window, a sprained wrist from a fall in the ice. Varath looked at the wrist with her careful, complete attention, and said it was not broken and would heal in 2 weeks with proper binding and rest, and bound it in that even, unhurried way, and Joran Hale's boy went home with his wrist wrapped and a somewhat dazed expression on his face, as though he had expected the appointment to be more alarming and was still adjusting to the fact that it hadn't been. By midwinter there had been 7 more patients. Not all of them were from the nearby farms. 2 had ridden in from Aldenvale, and 1 had come from the far side of the valley, having heard something on the road. Edric made tea in the kitchen during appointments and kept the fire going and otherwise stayed out of the way, except when extra hands were needed. And sometimes, when extra hands were needed, they were his. The valley slowly adjusted itself. It did not do this all at once, or uniformly, or without the occasional evening at the tavern where someone expressed concern about what exactly was happening down the South Road. But the Hale family was not shy about saying what they thought, and the Hale girl had been the one with the chest cough, and 3 other families had their own reasons by now to feel differently than they might have. Frontier people, in Edric's experience, were not sentimental about their fears when their fears turned out to be practically wrong. On a morning in late winter, old Martin Gale, he who spotted everything from his upper pasture, came to the door with a bad knee he had been walking on wrong for a month and a half. He sat in the chair in Varath's room with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was going to hold to it whatever his face tried to do, and Varath examined the knee without comment and told him what was wrong and what would help, and bound it and showed him the exercises, and when he stood to go, she told him to come back in 3 weeks. "She'll know if you skip the exercises," Edric said, when Martin was putting on his coat. Martin snorted. But he came back in 3 weeks, and the knee was better, and he sat in the chair with less decision on his face and more of something else, relief mostly, with a corner of something that in a less stubborn man might have been sheepishness. He did not throw stones. Nobody threw stones. Spring came and the pass opened, and Varath went north with her pack horse and her replenished kit, taking Sieve and Orth with her for the first full summer season of their training. Drath came with them on the pass crossing and then turned south again at the high road. He had, it emerged, a commitment in a town 3 valleys over that he was characteristically vague about. Edric watched her go from the gate. He had been watching her go from the gate for a year now, and he had arrived at a settled understanding that watching someone go was only one part of the thing, and the other part was knowing they were coming back. She left a list on his prep table of the patients she was expecting over the summer, with notes on each, and specific instructions in her clear handwriting about what to do and what to say in each case when she was not there. She had been teaching him things steadily all winter, not as a formal arrangement, but in the way that happens when 2 people spend enough time together in close quarters around a shared subject. A word here, a correction there, a question answered in full. He knew more than he had known. He knew he did not know enough, and also that knowing you did not know enough was one of the more important things to know. He kept the fire going in the prep room, and the herbs aired out the way she had shown him and dealt with what he could deal with, and sent the rest down the road to the physician in Aldenvale, with a note. She came back in late summer, brown from the upland sun and tired in the way that comes from several months of being genuinely necessary, and she came through the gate and said Edric, and he said Varath, and that was that, the whole of the welcome contained in the 2 names and the way they were said, which was enough. He had made porridge that morning without thinking about it, the way she had corrected him into making it, and when she sat at the table and tasted it she said nothing, which was her way of saying it was correct. She ate the whole bowl. Then she poured herself a second cup of tea and looked out at the south meadow through the kitchen window, and the set of her shoulders, which had been carrying something taut and watchful for months, came down slowly into something easier. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat down across from her. Outside the window the late summer light was long and golden across the yard, and the south meadow was still heavy with what had grown there, and through the window of the new south rooms the afternoon light came in exactly the way he had said it would. There is a man in the Aldenvale Valley who farms a piece of land on the South Road, and his farm, which used to be a quiet place, is not as quiet as it was. In the early mornings there are sometimes horses in the lane and sometimes fires in the south window before first light. In the winter there are footprints of various sizes crossing the yard, and sometimes the smell of something green and medicinal drifting from the south corner, which the people near the valley have mostly stopped remarking on, because it has become simply one of the ordinary facts of where they live. Martin Gale, who still spots everything from his upper pasture, mentioned to a man in town one afternoon that the healer down the South Road had a sure hand, and that if you went to her, she told you plain what was wrong and what would fix it, and that her husband made decent tea while you waited. Edric Galt, who was standing near enough to hear this, said nothing and let it stand. Some things you don't correct. Some things you simply let be what they are: the farm on the South Road, the fire in the south window, the two names said in the morning when one of them comes back through the gate, and the long table in the kitchen where the healer's manual sits open and the tea is always on, and the valley outside green and growing and well tended, the same as it always was and not at all the same as it was at all.